In this video, I'm going to continue on with a discussion of separation of powers and checks and balances. And I'm going to try and do this in a way that's sensitive to the fact that sometimes we have students who are visually impaired. And so I'm going to try and describe what's on the screen as well as explain what's on the screen to make this information as accessible to anybody as possible. So on the top, it says separation of powers, and then you can see there's a horizontal box that to the left says national, and directly below that horizontal box that says states. What those are supposed to represent, those horizontal boxes are supposed to represent, is the governing authority given to the national government by the Constitution, and then the governing authority given to the national government by the states, to the states, right? That's what federalism is, a division of governing authority between the federal government and the state government. The reason that the framers did this is because they wanted to make sure that no group had too much power. And so they divided governing authority between the national government and the state government. In the picture that I have up there, the line between the national government and the state government is just a straight line, very clear, as if the difference or the distinction between that which is federal and that which is state. And by the way, when I use federal, national, they mean the same thing. That line makes it appear as if it's a very clear demarcation between what power belongs to the federal government and what power belongs to state governments. And that's not true. It would probably be best if that line was like a squiggly line, because there's a constant negotiation going on between the national government and the state government over who has authority, who has governing authority in certain areas. And we'll be talking about this over the course of the semester. Now, as I said before, and I'm repeating myself just to make sure that these points are clear, when the framers wrote the Constitution, they were getting away from a unitary form of government. Remember, the king had all the authority, the ability to write laws, the ability to enforce laws, the ability to interpret laws. And so the first thing that the framers did as it pertained to the national government was divide governing authority into three different branches: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. And they gave them each specific responsibilities. The legislative branch writes the laws. The executive branch enforces the laws. The judicial branch interprets the laws. So that rather than that being vested in one person, right, which would create a tyranny, they divided it up to different branches. And on this depiction, you can see that the legislative branch, the horizontal box that is the legislative branch, is a little bit bigger than the executive or the judicial branch. What that's meant to show is that for the framers' perspective, they really wanted the legislative branch to be the center of the political universe, as I said in the last video. And so most of the constitutionally granted authority was given explicitly to the legislative branch. But because they were concerned about there being too much power concentrated in one group of people, what did they do to the legislative branch? They cut it in half. They divided it. They created a bicameral legislature. There's a House and there's a Senate. And so that's why the legislative branch now is divided in half, to make sure that now power is distributed not just between the executive, legislative, and judicial, but between the executive, the House, the Senate, and the courts, the judicial branch. This was the idea that the framers were working on, to separate the powers and give each of them their own responsibilities on what they were supposed to handle, what their prerogatives were. And as you'll find out, the House is allowed to do certain things, the Senate is allowed to do certain things, the President is allowed to do certain things, and the courts, the judicial branch, are allowed to do certain things. Now, at the same time, that horizontal box where the states are, the reason it has sort of an irregular shape is that that's intended to depict 13 states, the number of states that were present at the beginning of the Union. But if you were to look inside of each of those states, what you would see is the same setup. Within each of the states, there's an executive, a legislative, and judicial branch, right? Now, in one case, Nebraska, the legislative branch is unicameral, meaning there's just one body. But in every other state, they created an executive branch, a legislative branch that was bicameral, and a judicial branch. And the idea, again, is to spread decision-making authority among as many people as possible so that power is spread out among the national government, power is spread out to the states, and then within the states, power is spread out even more so that the ability of any one group to take too much power, encroach on too much power of the other branches or the national and state government becomes difficult because everybody has a little bit of power. Nobody has a ton. That's separation of powers. Now let's go to what this concept of checks and balances, right? As I said before, the legislative branch writes the laws, the executive branch enforces the laws, the judicial branch interprets the laws, right? The idea here is to give them each a separate function. But the way checks and balances works is that there are certain, when I use the word checks, by the way, you can substitute the word restrains. So we call it checks and balances, but when we're talking about this, we're really talking about restraining. So in this system of checks and balances, the executive branch has the ability to check Congress or restrain Congress. Congress has the ability to check the president or restrain the president. The president has the ability to check the judicial branch, and the judicial branch has the ability to check the executive branch. And then lastly, the judicial branch has the ability to check the legislative branch, and the legislative branch has the ability to check the courts. That way they keep everybody in line. Everybody's kept in check, restrained. Now, one of the things that's challenging to talk about checks and balances at this point in the semester is we haven't talked about the authority that the legislative branch has, or that the courts have, or that the executive branch has. And so the concept of checks and balances is what I want you to know and what is shown in this picture here, and that is just that each has the ability to check the other. But to give you an example of what I'm talking about, here's sort of a breakdown of what it looks like. For example, the legislative branch has the ability to pass bills, right? They can write out bills. They don't become laws until the president signs them, or well, let's just stop there. They have the ability to pass bills. If they want something done, if they think that it's a good idea, they can pass a bill. And when they pass that bill, it goes to the president. The president has the ability to veto the bill. In other words, the president could say, no, I don't like this. Now, we'll talk about why the president has that authority later on, but the president can veto the bill and basically send it back to Congress and say, I'm sending this back, I don't like it for these reasons. Well, what can happen then is that Congress can override the veto. So whereas the veto on the part of the president checks the legislative branch and says, you know what, I don't like what you guys have done here, so I'm going to veto it. The legislative branch then has the ability to override the veto. But whereas passing a law, a bill only takes a simple majority, 50% plus one, to override the veto takes a 2/3 vote in the House and in the Senate. Now, if this bill that they passed that was vetoed then gets a support of 2/3 of the House and the Senate, then it becomes a law. But even then, at that point, the courts could determine that that law was unconstitutional and it would be gone. And that's what I mean by them each having the ability to check one another. This is just one example. As we go on through the semester, we'll return back to this idea of checks and balances, and you guys will have a clearer idea. But just as a summation of this slide shows some of the ways in which the branches can check one another. Now, I already talked about some of these, so I'm not fond of reading slides to students, but I'll make an exception in this case, especially for visually impaired students. But on the left-hand side, it says the U.S. Congress makes the country's laws. It has two chambers, the House and Senate. Congress can check the executive branch through its power to appropriate funds. It controls the purse. And so it decides how much money the country is going to spend. The president, though, can veto or reject a law, but that Congress can override that veto, right? The Senate, if the president wants to approve somebody nominate somebody for an appointment or signs a treaty, they have to get that approved by the Senate. The House has the power to impeach a president, which just means that they found enough evidence that the president should be removed from office. But the Senate is the one that actually holds the trial, right? And so that's an example of the way everybody checks one another. The president enforces federal laws and is control of the army, is the one who can negotiate treaties, appoint judges, ambassadors, and other high officials, right? The president can check Congress by vetoing bills, but again, Congress can override the veto. The president can check the power of the courts because the president has the ability to nominate somebody to the Supreme Court, but they have to be approved by the Senate. And this is true not of just the Supreme Court, but also of all federal courts. The president can also pardon somebody if they've been accused of a crime. That doesn't really check anybody other than perhaps the courts if the president feels that somebody has been unfairly convicted. And then the Supreme Court has the ability to check Congress by ruling a law unconstitutional and essentially wiping it off the books. And the court can also check the power of the president by ruling any actions that he takes unconstitutional as well. Once again, the idea is to create a free-for-all. Now, let me be clear. You don't have to memorize all this stuff. We're going to be talking about all these things over the course of the semester, but I want to give you a general idea of what I mean by checks and balances. So separation of powers is the idea of creating so many decision-making centers that no one group becomes too powerful. Checks and balances is the idea that you give each branch of government the ability to protect its own prerogatives, what it's allowed to do, but also to prevent also to restrain other branches if those other branches try and create too much power. I hope this was helpful and not too confusing, but again, we will be discussing this over the course of the entire class, and we'll revisit this later and it'll make so much more sense, I hope.